Should art stand alone? I struggled to think of a suitable pithy title for this video, so some explanation is probably necessary. So when I ask, should art stand alone, I'm really, first of all, mainly talking about literature, because that's kind of my thing. What I mean by stand alone is, should it be able to understand that work of art, that piece of literature, that book, story, poem, song, without any reference to external sources? Should it be understandable on its own terms? Now, one of the inspirations for my raising this question comes from watching a music reaction video. Now, the person involved was sent a request by someone for him to react to a particular song, and they began to give him some context, some background of the song. And he was adamant that he wasn't going to read any of that he wasn't interested in any of that he would listen to the song and react to it as it was. In his opinion, if it wasn't clear from the song itself what it was about, then it wasn't well written. Is he right? It will give away something of my point of view when I tell you that I unsubscribed from his channel immediately. Of course, why that's so, why I disagree with him, at least partially, requires some unpacking. It's fairly clear that if you're reading a piece of literature from an earlier period, such as, say, Homer's Odyssey or Shakespeare or even the Bible, you actually need to understand something about the historical and cultural context in which that book, that piece of literature was written and in which it was set. You can't really understand Homer's Odyssey or the Iliad without understanding something of the historical context. You just can't. Now, people at the time may well have been able to understand it. They didn't need the assistance that we need. But we do. Same with the Bible, same with Shakespeare. It was a different world, and we simply won't understand what they're talking about if we don't understand something of the world around them. In more contemporary literature, it becomes another issue. For example, consider T.S. Eliot's poem, The Wasteland. In that poem, Eliot makes reference to all kinds of mythological and literary sources, and it really helps in the interpretation of that poem to know what those are. You'll be kind of lost without some notes, maybe with them too, to be honest. It's quite a difficult poem. But for example, you really won't even begin to come close to understand the poem if you don't understand who Tiresias is. Tiresias is referenced several times in the poem and is really key to understanding it. Now, he was a blind seer from Greek mythology, known, among other things, for changing gender. I quote one particular critic here. I can't honestly remember who this was, so I'm sorry I can't give you a citation for this. But this particular critic said, "It would be difficult to understand the Wasteland without wrestling with this question: what does Tiresias see?" Thinking through some of the essential narratives that include Tiresias, especially Homer's Odyssey, Ovid's Metamorphoses, and Sophocles' Oedipus Rex, can offer connection to many of the major motifs of the Wasteland, including blindness, gender ambiguity, withheld knowledge, cryptic prophecy, dangerous sexual power, stagnant relationships, plagued land, and death by water. So I think it's fair to say that you really can't understand that poem fully, and I don't claim to, without having an understanding of Tiresias and probably a whole range of other mythological and literary sources. So, to some extent, maybe to a large extent, The Wasteland is literature talking to literature. Is that fair on us mere mortals? Well, consider James Joyce's Ulysses. Now, that's a very difficult book to understand at any level, with its Irishisms and the fact that it's set back at the beginning of the 20th century. But it's impossible to even scratch the surface without knowing Homer's Odyssey. You won't have a clue what the book is about unless you understand the stories and adventures that Ulysses has in the Odyssey. It's essential to the entire structure of the novel. So again, literature talking to literature, an elite club perhaps. But in this sense it's clear that some works of art that are considered great works of literature, such as The Wasteland or Ulysses by James Joyce, can't really be understood without understanding some of this historical, cultural, mythological context. But there's another aspect of this which needs exploring too. To what extent can art be separated from the artist, from their personal life, from their personal story? Now, this is often asked in the context of whether the appreciation of a person's art is affected by their moral behaviour. But I'm looking at something different here. Consider Sylvia Plath. In her poem, The Rival, she writes, I'll put this on the screen for you. I'm going to read the whole poem. I'm sorry if you find that tedious. If you don't like poetry, you probably stopped watching this video a while back anyway. So this is The Rival by Sylvia Plath. If the moon smiled, she would resemble you. You leave the same impression of something beautiful but annihilating. Both of you are great light borrowers. Her own mouth grieves at the world. Yours is unaffected. And your first gift is making stone out of everything. I wake to a mausoleum. You are here, ticking your fingers on the marble table, looking for cigarettes, spiteful as a woman, but not so nervous, and dying to say something unanswerable. The moon, too, abuses her subjects, but in the daytime she is ridiculous. Your dissatisfactions, on the other hand, arrive through the mail slot with loving regularity, white and blank, expansive as carbon monoxide. No day is safe from news of you, walking about in Africa maybe, but thinking of me. First of all, I'll just point out that there's at least one mythological reference in there that it helps to know, and I think it's in the line, and your first gift is making stone out of everything, which seems to me to be a reference to Medusa from Greek mythology. Now, with a little research, you find out that this poem is actually about Sylvia's husband's mistress, a woman by the exotic name of Assia Weevil, a poem in itself. Does this poem need to tell us that? Should it make this explicit? Do we need to know that in order to appreciate it? I don't think we actually have to know who it is to appreciate the poem, at least to some extent. We still see the character of the woman beautifully sketched. We still understand her, or at least the narrator's view of her, without knowing exactly who she is. However, knowing who it is, her husband's mistress, helps us to understand the why of the poem, why she thought it necessary to comment on this person at all, and why she feels this way about her. When I've edited books, it's often been clear to me that the writer has much more in their head than what they've put on the page. This sometimes means, though, that what's abundantly clear to the author themselves is not at all clear to the reader, who doesn't have all that stuff in their head, doesn't have all that background, all that history. Should the author spell it out, or is it enough to infer something? Spelling it out can be tedious. Inference is much more interesting. It leaves something to the reader's imagination. It leaves something for the reader to actually do other than just passively take in information. The reader doesn't need to be spoon-fed. Nevertheless, it's perhaps not a great idea to leave the reader floundering. They may feel lost and stop reading. In a case like this, they can't, after all, go and look it up in Wikipedia. But the inference has to be suitably evocative. Maybe give two or more inferences that point the reader in the right direction without fully spelling it out. Here in Plath's poem, she gives the reader at least two inferences. The first is in the title, The Rival. Now, of course, this doesn't immediately suggest mistress, but it doesn't exclude that either. It includes it as a possibility. Other possibilities remain open, which is probably a good thing, because people may have rivals who are not mistresses, and the poem can speak to them too. The second inference is actually from the emotional flavour of the poem itself. The author expresses great bitterness towards this rival, perhaps even hatred. So this lets the reader in on the importance of this rivalry, without necessarily directly connecting it to a mistress. It's the feeling the rival evokes in the author that is most important. This is what the author is capturing here, rather than some biographical reference to a figure in the person's life. So in that sense, the identity of the person is unimportant. It's the relationship to the author that's important. And this could hold true for a mistress, perhaps a sister, a mother, a rival poet, and so on. So perhaps the question of the person's actual identity is nothing more than idle curiosity. Plath's writing is extremely personal, drawing deeply on her own life experiences and emotions. It can be very difficult, if not impossible, to separate her art from her life. Of course, she does also draw on mythological themes, as is evident even in this poem here, but largely to express complex emotions, personal struggles, and universal themes. I think it's fair to say that her art could not exist, at least in its present form, if she hadn't lived the life she lived. Maybe that's true of all artists, but I can't help feeling that the work of Eliot and Joyce, for example, is much more calculated and clinical, more academic, but perhaps I'm being unfair to them. It's very difficult to understand Joyce and Eliot without a fairly extensive knowledge of literature and mythology. So does that make their work elitist? Possibly it does, yes. It seems to be aimed at a very specific and rather erudite audience. If you put the effort in, it's probably worth it. But no one could blame anyone for not wanting to put that effort in. I think it's possible to understand Plath's poetry, or at least this poem, without knowing precisely whom she's talking about. And that seems to me to be a good thing. It makes her work more accessible. I think it also makes her work more timeless. If understanding it depended too much on the precise details of her experience, it would probably lose its relevance over time. So then what's my answer to the question, should art stand alone? I guess the first part of my answer is that usually it clearly doesn't. I think any work which does stand alone without requiring any reference to the context or history or other literature may be understandable, may be comprehensible, but I suggest it probably lacks considerable depth. A work that does contain references to literature, or perhaps even to the person's life, requires more work in order to understand it. You may have to go off and do a bit of Google searching, a bit of Wikipedia reading to understand it. But that itself can be very enriching. You find yourself learning about history, about literature, and about the person. Now, to some extent, the writings of a poet such as Plath can be understood on their own, without having to search for their meaning. But I think it does help to know something about their life. It does give a richness to the poem to understand their mythological references. For example, just to consider again that poem, The Rival, I think it helps greatly to understand this line, "and your first gift is making stone out of everything," by referring it to Medusa. This adds another dimension to our understanding of the person that she's talking about. It provides a visual image also of the person. So no, art probably doesn't have to stand alone, and it may be richer, although requiring more work, if it doesn't.